The soil test results were still in her hand when the laughter started. Not polite laughter. The kind that fills a room without apology, the kind that bounces off cinder block walls and fluorescent lighting and lands on you like a second coat of cold. It was March of 2009, in the Giles County Extension Office in Petersburg, Virginia, and Dorothy Crane was 44 years old, standing at the counter with a manila folder pressed against her chest and a question on her face that nobody in that room wanted to take seriously. Outside, the mountains of the New River Valley were still wearing their gray winter coats. The parking lot was half-frozen mud. And in the warm, humming interior of that office, 3 men, the county extension agent, a neighboring farmer named Dale Pruitt, and Dale's son-in-law, who had no particular reason to be there except that he'd driven Dale in from Narrows, were trying very hard not to look at Dorothy while they failed completely to hide their amusement. She had told them what she was planning to do with her 40 acres. She was going to raise Ossabaw Island hogs. If you have spent time around agricultural offices in Western Virginia, you know that county agents carry a specific kind of patience, a professional courtesy stretched thin over years of listening to ideas that don't fit inside the boxes on their grant applications. The agent that morning, a man named Gerald Watts, had been working Giles County for 18 years. He had seen things. He had helped families through droughts and floods and the slow hemorrhage of commodity prices. He was not a cruel man. But when Dorothy Crane said the words Ossabaw Island hog out loud, in his office, with that quiet certainty in her voice, something slipped. Dorothy. He set down his pen. Those are feral pigs. They're heritage pigs, she said. From the barrier islands off Georgia. They've been there since the Spanish brought them over in the 1500s. Gerald Watts looked at Dale Pruitt. Dale Pruitt looked at his son-in-law. The son-in-law had the good sense to look at the floor, but his shoulders were shaking. They're small, Gerald said carefully. They're fat. Their feed conversion is. I know their feed conversion. Dorothy. You could put red wattles out there, or even some Berkshires if you want a heritage angle. You could get a decent price per pound on Berkshires. Restaurants are paying for Berkshires now. I know what restaurants are paying for Berkshires. Dale Pruitt had been quiet until then. He was 61, had farmed tobacco most of his life, and he wore the specific confidence of a man who has decided, somewhere in middle age, that he already knows enough. He cleared his throat. She'll lose the place inside 3 years, he said. To Gerald, not to her. As if Dorothy had already left the room. She had not left the room. She tucked the manila folder under her arm, thanked Gerald Watts for his time in a voice that carried not a single tremor, and walked back out into the half-frozen parking lot. The door swung shut behind her. Through the glass, she could see Dale saying something to his son-in-law, and his son-in-law nodding, and Gerald going back to his desk. She sat in her truck for a long moment, the engine ticking in the cold. The folder on the seat beside her. Inside it, soil composition reports, a 12-page breed profile she had typed herself on an old Brother printer, and a letter from a small farm cooperative in Roanoke that had shown, cautiously, some interest. She looked at the mountains. The gray winter coats. The long ridgelines that the Appalachians had been wearing since before anyone around here knew what a hog was. Then she started the truck and drove home. If you believe the land rewards patience, and I mean real patience, the kind that doesn't ask for witnesses, type harvest before this story ends. Because what Dorothy Crane did over the next 3 years on that 40 acres in Giles County is the kind of thing that doesn't fit on a grant application either. But it fits on a bank statement. And it fits in the memory of every person who ever laughed in that extension office. Dorothy had come to the land sideways, the way a lot of people do. She had spent 15 years in Blacksburg working as a lab technician for a veterinary diagnostic facility, not glamorous work, but precise, and precision suited her. When her mother died in 2006 and left her the farm off Sinking Creek Road, most people expected Dorothy to sell it. The house needed a new roof. The fencing was intermittent at best. The pastures had been hay ground for 2 decades and the soil, as the tests would later confirm, had been loved to exhaustion, organic matter down around 1.4%, compaction so deep a soil probe hit resistance at 8 inches. She did not sell. She took a leave of absence from the lab, moved into the farmhouse with a space heater and a borrowed dehumidifier, and spent the winter of 2007 reading. She read everything she could find on heritage swine. She wrote letters, actual handwritten letters, to 2 Ossabaw breeders, one in Maryland and one in North Carolina. She drove 4 hours to a small farm conference in Bristol and sat in the back row of a session led by a woman from Allegheny County who had been running a diversified heritage operation for 11 years, and she took 12 pages of notes in a spiral notebook with a chewed-up pen. What she kept coming back to, in all that reading and all those letters, was the Ossabaw's relationship with poor ground. The breed had developed over 4 centuries of near isolation on Ossabaw Island, off the Georgia coast. Spanish hogs, left behind when Spanish expeditions moved on, had survived without supplemental feed in a coastal environment that offered mast and roots and brackish marsh edges and not much else. Over generations, the animals had adapted in ways that were, from a production standpoint, inconvenient. They were small, mature sows rarely exceeded 150 pounds, boars sometimes hit 200 but not reliably. They laid down fat at an extraordinary rate, which was efficient for survival and deeply unfashionable in the commercial pork market, which had been chasing leanness since the 1980s. Their feed conversion was poor by any commodity standard. They grew slowly. But they foraged brilliantly. They could maintain condition on ground that would starve a commercial hybrid. They were calm, as pig breeds go, curious, adaptable, not given to the stress responses that plagued confinement animals. And their fat, their deep, creamy, oleic acid-rich fat, was the thing that kept appearing in the notes of food writers and chefs who had encountered it by accident, usually in Spain or in the research of someone trying to understand why Iberico pork tasted the way it did, and what it might mean that a functionally identical animal had been living on an American barrier island for 500 years. Dorothy understood what she had: degraded ground, limited capital, and an animal that was bred, at the cellular level, for exactly that situation. In the spring of 2009, 6 weeks after Gerald Watts's parking lot, she brought homemade Ossabaw gilts and 2 boars from the breeder in North Carolina. She paid $1,400 for the lot. The breeder, a woman named Annette Sorel, helped her load them into the trailer and shook her hand at the tailgate and said, "Give them time. They'll show you what they need." Dorothy gave them time. The 40 acres at Sinking Creek was divided, in those early days, into 4 rough paddocks using existing fence lines she had patched herself over 2 winters. She had read Alan Savory. She had read Jean Logsdon. She understood rotational grazing in theory, but theory and 40 acres of Virginia mountain ground are not the same conversation. The first season was a study in adjustment. The hogs were smaller than she had expected somehow, even knowing the numbers. Seeing a mature Ossabaw sow in a Virginia pasture, dense and low-slung and moving through the grass with that peculiar rolling efficiency, was a recalibration. They rooted. Of course they rooted. Hogs root the way rivers run. It is not a behavior, it is a condition of being. But Dorothy had planned for the rooting. She had read everything she could find on using swine as soil renovation tools, and she had sectioned her worst ground, the compacted, exhausted corner of the back 40 that had been under continuous hay production longest, into the first rotation. She let the hogs work it. They turned the top 6 inches in a way no tillage implement could replicate, breaking the compaction layer from below, incorporating their own manure as they moved, leaving behind a churned, aerated seedbed that Dorothy overseeded in October with a cover crop mix: crimson clover, hairy vetch, winter rye, and tillage radish. By that first November, she was already seeing something in the back paddock that she hadn't seen in the front pastures in years. Earthworms. The neighbors had their own theories about what she was doing. Dale Pruitt's farm bordered her east fence line, and Dale had a way of pausing at that fence whenever Dorothy was working nearby, not to talk, exactly, but to observe. He would lean on the top rail with his coffee, and he would watch the small dark shapes moving through the grass, and his expression said everything his words didn't need to. His wife, Barbara, was kinder but not by a lot. At the post office in Narrows one Saturday morning, she pulled Dorothy aside in that particular way rural women do when they want to warn you without seeming to interfere. "Honey, you know those things are half wild. They'll get out the first bad storm, and then Dale is going to have a problem." Dorothy thanked her. The Hogs did not get out in the first bad storm. Or the second. Or in any storm that followed. What the neighbors saw in those early seasons was what anyone standing outside a long process always sees: the surface. Muddy paddocks. Small, unphotogenic animals. No visible crop, no clear output, nothing to point to and call a yield. What Dorothy saw, down on her knees with a hand lens in the back corner of the second paddock, was a soiled biological community beginning to wake up. She was not trained as a soil scientist, but she had spent enough years in a diagnostic lab to understand what she was reading in the texture of the ground, in the color of the aggregates, in the increasing presence of organisms that had no reason to be in depleted soil except that the soil was no longer depleted in the ways it had been. She sent soil samples to Virginia Tech's soil testing lab in Blacksburg every fall. The first results, from October 2009, confirmed what the initial test had shown: organic matter at 1.4%, pH hovering around 6.1, compaction significant in the lower profile. In October 2010, the back paddock, the one the Hogs had worked first, came back at 1.9% organic matter. Still modest. But the direction was right. She did not tell anyone about this. There was no one to tell who would have found it interesting. The winter of 2010 to 2011 was the first real test. December came in cold and stayed. Snow fell on the 22nd and did not fully leave until late February. The temperatures dropped below zero twice in January, and a water pipe in the old farmhouse split at 3 in the morning on the 9th, and Dorothy spent 4 hours in a crawl space with a headlamp and plumber's tape that was too cold to adhere properly, and she came out blue-fingered and furious and stood in her kitchen at 7 in the morning eating crackers because there was nothing else ready, listening to the Hogs outside making the sounds that Ossabaws make in cold weather: low, conversational grumbles, not distress, just commentary. They were fine. They had deep bedding in the shelters she had built from salvaged lumber, and they had access to the root cellar runoff where she dumped kitchen scraps and culled vegetables, and they were fine. Dale Pruitt lost 4 feeder pigs that January to cold stress. His operation was standard commercial cross, Hampshire Duroc crosses he bought as weaners and finished out, and they were housed in a structure that had served adequately for 20 years until that particular cold snap. He didn't say anything to Dorothy about it. He didn't need to. She heard it from Barbara at the post office, passed along with the specific brevity of someone delivering news that has already cost something. Spring 2011. The second rotation of Hogs had gone through all 4 paddocks by now, and Dorothy was adding a 5th paddock, carved out of what had been a brushy corner along the creek drainage. She had brought in a neighbor's small excavator for a day to clear the worst of the multiflora rows, and she had spent a week pulling volunteer locust and autumn olive by hand and with a weed wrench, and she had planted the recovered ground with a deep-rooting perennial mix: chicory, plantain, red and white clover, orchard grass, and a small percentage of turnips. The Hogs would cycle through this paddock last, giving it a full growing season before they worked it. She had also made a decision about her marketing. The Roanoke Cooperative had followed up in late 2010 with a more formal inquiry. They had 3 restaurant accounts asking specifically for heritage pork, lard-type breeds, they said, high oleic acid content, old breeds, and they had not been able to source enough product to satisfy the interest. Dorothy had driven to Roanoke in October and met with the cooperative's sourcing coordinator, a young woman named Priya Mehta who had grown up in Blacksburg and cared about provenance in a way that people who had grown up around commodity agriculture sometimes found slightly exhausting. But Priya knew her market. "What we can sell," Priya said, "is the story. And the fat profile. If you can get us a fatty acid analysis on your cuts, and if the oleic acid numbers are what they should be for Ossabaw and pasture, we're talking about a different price per pound than anything you'd get wholesale." Dorothy had the fatty acid analysis done at a food science lab in Harrisonburg. The numbers came back in February 2011. Oleic acid in the back fat, 47.3%. The USDA baseline for commodity pork back fat runs around 38 to 40%. The Ossabaws, finished on pasture and mast, and the deep-rooted perennials Dorothy had been establishing, were producing a fat profile closer to Iberico than to anything else in the American market. She sent the results to Priya. Priya sent them to the restaurants. The restaurants said yes. But this is where the story gets complicated, because yes from restaurants in 2011 meant almost nothing in terms of immediate volume, and almost nothing in terms of immediate income, and Dorothy had now been running this operation for 2 full years on savings and a part-time consulting arrangement with the Blacksburg Diagnostic Lab that kept the lights on but did not leave much extra. The mortgage on the place had been her mother's, transferred to Dorothy's name, and it was a modest number. The farm had been in the family for decades and was mostly paid, but the property taxes were not modest and the fence repairs were not modest, and the cost of a veterinary visit when one of the sows developed a respiratory issue in the summer of 2011 was not modest at all. She kept records of everything. In a spiral notebook like the one she'd used at the conference in Bristol, with a pen she did not let herself chew because she needed it to last. Income column, expense column, note column. The note column was where she put what she was actually learning: soil temperatures at planting, germination rates on the cover crop mixes, forage mass estimates by paddock, the weight gain curves of the hogs against the specific forage mix they were on at each stage. It was in that notebook that she first wrote down, in August of 2011, a number that would not mean anything to anyone else for almost 2 more years.